Okay, if everyone can take their seats now. Thank you. Right, welcome everybody. Just to introduce ourselves, my name is Martin Francis. I'm chairing the meeting tonight. I'll tell you my political affiliation, so it's not hidden. I'm a member of the Green Party locally, and I do the blog Wembley Matters. Our panel tonight, and very, very pleased to have everybody here. There is Sophie from Friends of the Earth, Suzanne Jefferies from 1 Million Climate Jobs, Ruth from Pure Poverty Action still, okay, and Miranda Qureshi from, well, you're a London Assembly member and chair of the GLA's Environment Committee. So we're going to start right away. Thank you all for coming, and you're all very welcome. Do please, if you feel yourself flagging, go make yourself a cup of tea whenever you want one. Okay, so we're going to begin with Suzanne Jefferies, who start us off.
So Ken...
Oh, just one thing.
Yeah.
The video in the meeting tonight is going to be used to go on the Campaign Against Climate Change website. Is there anyone here who objects to being videoed? No? So you're fine. Thank you.
Can you point out the toilets?
I think most people can raise...
What, on the video? They might have the glasses on, you think.
Okay. And there's also a disabled one just behind Ken there. And fire exit straight out there, or straight out there. Thank you. Right, let's go.
Okay, thank you. So Ken, who invited me, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak tonight, did ask me, would I be happy to do a sort of a bit of an overview, as well as talk about many climate jobs, and I agreed to do that. So if you wonder why I'm just talking about lots of others rather than really climate jobs, that's why. But hopefully you're familiar with this, and I will talk about it towards the end. Just on the question of flooding, I think for me, and no doubt for many other people, the aerial shots that we had in the last few days of the Thames Valley and Somerset Levels, I mean, for me, they were the things that really made me feel, you know, about how dramatic the situation was. To see areas of the country which are quite familiar with, quite familiar with the Thames Valley, just disappear, not exist anymore, be a sea of water, was really quite an amazing thing to see. And it really very much, all those landscapes just disappearing, really brought it home for me. And I think that one of the things that has happened, in my opinion anyway, that over the last few weeks, is that those kind of experiences for some people and a view of what was happening from other people have either confirmed for many people or woken up many other people to climate change as an issue, but also as a lived reality, not as something in the future, not as something that happens in other parts of the world to other people, but something that is happening, a lived reality for us. And one of the things I think it's done is it's punctured this idea, which is definitely touted around by the climate skeptics. If the climate skeptics, they acknowledge that there may be a warming planet, but obviously argue from their point of view that this is nothing to do with human activity. When they argue that when they point out there's a warming planet, they sort of create this impression that it's going to be a very gradual process, very slow, something that's very adaptable to, and people like Gordon Patterson, the environment, clearly give the idea that maybe something we could benefit from. You know, maybe it's something, you know, us living in the northern climes that we do, maybe actually be something we would appreciate, you know, a little bit of warmth in the atmosphere, etc. And I think the last few weeks have definitely punctured that for many, many people, and therefore I do think it's a really important moment for campaigners to grasp and to really take that opportunity to press home an advantage, which it's not right way, but a political advantage in terms of people's understanding of the situation, which has sometimes felt like it hasn't existed for us for a fair period of time, particularly post-Copenhagen, where many activists maybe felt that the climate sceptics, and there's a pretty motley crew of them, have been able to take the advantage in the situation. So that's the first thing that I think that I would say. Owen Paterson claims that climate change is something that we can adapt to, and I think that the last few weeks clearly indicated that that's not the reality. That's not going to be the reality. That was 2 weeks of bad weather, 2 months, of very unusual weather for us. Imagine what it would be like with that kind of sustained level of weather, and the inability to cope even with those 2 months. I think the other thing that's perhaps happened, I'd certainly like to suggest and hope that it has happened, is that the Tory government have been exposed on this issue, both for their failure of the question of climate change. Obviously came in as supposedly the greenest government ever, but only a few weeks before these weather events, we had Cameron saying he was wanting to get rid of all that rubbish green stuff, all those rubbish green subsidies. How did he put it? Get rid of all the green crap. Yeah, get rid of all the green crap. And rather than being the greenest government ever, clearly we've had a situation in which the sceptics have ruled. Osborne's last budget was a budget that was clearly dictated by the oil, coal and gas and fracking industry. They got everything that they wanted out of Osborne. I mean, he was a pushover. He was with them from the word go. And their attitude to climate change, for me, small pleasure has been to hear the likes of Lawson increasingly come across, as they should do, as cranks, as flat earthers, and sounding like that when they're engaged in argument and debate. Not just for people who are used to critiquing them in their own mind, but for everyday, ordinary people who aren't used to it, but just to hear the likes of Lawson talk in the way that he talks about climate change not happening in the context of the kind of weather events that were happening, it just doesn't fit for people.
Still won the debate on the Radio 4 Today programme.
Sorry?
You still won the debate on the Radio 4 Today programme.
Have you saved contributions?
Sure, but in what sense, sorry?
Well, there was a professor from one of the universities who is qualified in climate change with God knows how many years' experience, who was muted by Lawson's crank arguments that there's been no climate change in the last 15 years.
Okay.
So he still wins.
Okay, I'm making a different point in the sense that I don't think he wins the argument with the public, and I think that has started to shift, and I think it's started to shift very, very dramatically. In this country, in the last few years, the US is worse, but in this country, in the last few years, since Copenhagen, since the climate sceptics went on the offensive, you've seen an increase in the number of people that are not believing that climate change isn't happening, something from about 4% to 90%. There's still low figures in comparison to the majority of people who do believe that it's happening. And that process has been reversed, and it's increasingly been reversed. So, yes, you may be muted, but that's in the context of a very defensive bunch of people. And I think one of the things I would suggest is that scientists and the activists have to stop being so defensive about it. We have to stop being so defensive about it, because there is a real opportunity for us here to raise the argument, raise the question of climate change, and start to make some really meaningful headway with wide numbers of people. If you don't agree, that's absolutely fine, but we'll perhaps let me finish and then you can chip in later on. Back to the Tories, the question of exposing the Tories. I think they have been exposed over that, and I think they've also been exposed over the whole question of austerity, what they've done in terms of the Environment Agency. I don't think Pickles won the argument in terms of the Environment Agency was to blame. He had to backpedal on that very, very quickly, as it became very clear to people that huge cuts that this government have made to the Environment Agency are, as culpable in this situation for the misery that people feel as the bigger weather events themselves. And one of the things that stayed a little bit more hidden, but deserves attention, George Monbiot brought people's attention to it, is actually the whole process of deregulation that the Tories have touted and was going on before that, but they've speeded it up. Deregulation, particularly around subsidies, wealthy farmers, land use, all of that kind of stuff, are aspects which have intensified the problems. Under the last government, for example, growing maize, you had to comply with a set of regulations in order to get the subsidies, and those regulations were ones which attempted to maintain the land use as something which wouldn't intensify and deepen flooding problems. This government's just ripped that up altogether, so we are paying, as George Monbiot says, for a change in land use, which in terms of Somerset levels was absolutely central to one of the elements why there was such a dramatic problem. I want to just conclude in this section here by saying my personal feeling is things have started to shift. I think it's a real important turning point, and one that hopefully we can recognise and hopefully we can really work to make some headway out of. It was good eventually to hear climate change as part of the debate about what was happening and why it was happening. One of the things that was less talked about, however, was the question of energy and energy policy. And I think that's one of the other links that we've got to make. There's no doubt about it that the weather events that we've seen are a result of climate change. They are therefore likely to happen more regularly, more frequently, with greater intensity. This is at one level of warming, 1 degree level of warming. What the scientists are saying is that the way that we are not reducing emissions is something that unfortunately is now putting us on track for much higher levels of warming. Government and policies have aimed to keep within a sort of spurious 2 degree warming limit, but everything about policy at the moment is moving us not towards a 2 degree limit on warming, but 4 degrees levels of warming. And the whole thing just becomes really quite hard to conceptualise in any kind of meaningful way. I'm just going to give you a quick quote from James Hansen, who talks about 4 degrees warming like this. He says, for 4 degrees warming would be enough to melt all the ice. You would have a tremendously chaotic situation as you moved away from our current climate towards another one. That's a different planet. You wouldn't recognise it. We're on the verge of creating climate chaos if we don't begin to reduce emissions rapidly. And that's the point. All of those scientists who make the most alarming predictions, not to alarm for the sake of alarm, but because that's what the science and the modelling and all the rest of it is saying. And thus far they've been proved quite correct. They're making that point in order to underline that there is still a possibility of us changing that scenario in that future, but it requires those massive radical reductions in emissions, and not in the future, not by 2030, not by 2050, but now, and the process has to begin now. Which is why I'm just going to finish up on the question of energy, because what this government has done, and this is why I think we have to start connecting with the question of energy, out of the floods, out of the arguments and debates and discussions that are starting to happen. What this government have done is they are locking us in to not a reduction in emissions, but actually massive rises in emissions because of the energy base that they are, the infrastructure that they are policy-wise agreeing to as we speak. The dash for gas, which I'm sure that Ruth will speak about more, and so will Sophie. The huge subsidies for nuclear supposedly is a clean energy, but actually wasted money that could have been spent on renewable energy. And most crucially, the question of fracking, most crucially the question of fracking, not because in terms of potentially the scale of emissions that could be produced from fracking, although they are enormous if they're able to frack the kind of future that they want to. But more, I think, what it represents in terms of symbolism. You know, we should be leaving the fossil fuels in the ground, and instead of leaving the fossil fuels in the ground, they are coming up with more and more extreme methods of getting the fossil fuels out of the ground. So I thought I'd just finish focus on fracking because I think of its symbolism, but also I think because of the reaction that they've been met with around fracking. You know, the wool is not being pulled over people's eyes, despite the need for employment in all kinds of communities that are crying out for it. Actually, in lots of communities, there's been the push for fracking has been met with resistance. So, I think we've got a threefold task. I was up in Salford recently at a meeting organised by the Campaign Against Climate Change Trade Union Group. It was a really fantastic meeting outside Barton Moss, and it was hosted by the local Unison group. And to it came local activists, local people from the community, and trade unions. And it was a really fascinating meeting for the process of what could be going on in our communities at this moment in time. If we campaign for it, if we fight for it. There was a genuine debate where, for example, the chair of the Unison said, look, this hasn't come easy to me, it hasn't come easy to all of our union members. A lot of our union members, quite understandably, are saying, well, you know, what's wrong with this fracking? Why can't we get jobs? I know it might be a little bit dangerous, but lots of things we do in industry. And they have had to have some real open, honest debates and discussions where they have, you know, looked at themselves and examined arguments and debated things and whatever. Out of that, the Unison branch there, which represents the biggest employer, you know, has taken a position against fracking after debate and discussion. And they've now passed a motion which will go to Unison Conference, which I think is the first time that Unison Conference has sort of seriously discussed the motion on climate change, on fracking and those kind of issues. Now, I think they're the kind of opportunities that we've got if we take it at this moment in time. 1 million climate jobs is hopefully a small contribution to the debate. It aims to say that we can reduce emissions. 80% of our emissions we could reduce quickly if we were creating jobs that were focused on reducing emissions. And they are quite simply jobs in which energy is produced properly, renewably, cleanly, if that's what we were shifting our energy production to. If we were insulating our homes to reduce energy use, if we were creating a proper transport system that allowed people to get out of their cars and travel in a way which is not throwing more and more emissions into the atmosphere, if we were educating people about what was going on, if we were educating people about the kind of technologies that could make a difference, we can reduce those emissions. And I think those kind of policies, 1 million climate jobs is part of it. I think the campaign that Fuel Poverty Action have run is another part of that. If we can start popularising those kind of policies in the current climate, excuse my pun, I think that we stand the possibility of demonstrating to people that there are alternatives, that it doesn't have to be the way that Owen Paterson tells us it's got to be, that George Osborne tells us it's got to be. There are real alternatives, and those policies are policies that people could find very, very popular and very, very palatable as a way of creating decent employment, but most importantly, saving the planet on which we all rely.
Thank you very much. Just to mention, before we go on to the next speaker, that Brent Friends of the Earth were very successful with a small demonstration at Willesden Green in raising the issue of fracking in Brent. And the result was that Brent Council adopted a position of no fracking in Brent, rather controversially because there were arguments about the geology and so on, but a symbolic gesture by the council was very welcome. Okay, now then we turn to Ruth London from the Fuel Poverty Action, and you can sort of take up the baton from there, I think, quite well.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to start with the green tech actually, because everybody knows that the government saved you about